Okay, welcome Jeremy, my favourite vicar of them all.
Thank you.
Where were you vicar and what was the context?
Okay, so I'm talking about when I was a vicar in Widnes. Many people may know, Lancastrian town, out just the edges of Liverpool. So I'm from Liverpool myself, so Widnes was a bit of a stretch. And so it's an old industrial town, chemical town, and the particular parish I'm really talking about here, I was connected to a few, but particularly parish was St Paul's, which is high on your index of multiple deprivation sort of thing. It's 3% sort of. But with the old town centre as well, so it was based on the old Victorian square. Everything else around it was now nightclubs. So it was no longer the civic centre, and then the church and the vicarage there on this old square. So that's where, and we pronounce it Mugger, not Muga. Yes, Mugger. And yes, so all that sort of estate sort of stuff of muggers and the like with her.
Okay, and what did you do and why? The way.
Okay, so I suppose for me, as I became the vicar there's two things which in the first 6 months really struck me. The first was that I'm an Anglican and I have a charge for this parish, and yet when I walk around the parish and compare the demographic of the people in the parish to the people in the church, we were clearly not doing our job. In that it wasn't right, it wasn't my choice to decide to serve one segment of the parish as opposed to the whole parish. And I don't want to sort of talk negatively about other streams of Christianity, but in other streams people do maybe, you're setting up a church for different reasons or whatever, and great. But as an Anglican, I'm actually going to have this charge for the parish. So I couldn't rest when thinking, but the demographic doesn't match. And mainly that was a matter of age, really. As in lots of urban areas, there's a certain class demographic as well, of some members of the congregation being people who had made good and moved out. But we didn't actually have too much of that. But the main thing was an age question. St Paul's, when I became the vicar there, we had a congregation of about 40, good people, well taught, very faithful. But I think 7 were under 65 and probably half over 75. And the problem was they had all got a year older every year. And that's actually quite a common problem, isn't it? And so, and that's the problem. So no one new had come to the church for 20 years. And when you looked at that then, you had a church which had a very good basis 20 years ago, if you talk about age demographic and kids and whatever. But 20 years later, the same thing is a difficulty. Now, I was really lucky. They were really prayerful and committed, and the finances were all right. The roof was secure. The building was a bit old, but actually worked. It was okay. So we're at this good point. And the second thing I realised after 6 months was that I would not invite anyone to the services. So, likely lad, I'm off around town talking to the council, talking to people in different places and doing my bit as a vicar. And I realised that people like me, people of my age, people I was, relating to, I wasn't completely sure that I would invite them to the service. And I sort of sat down and thought, oh, but if I'm the vicar and think that, if I'm a congregation member, you can dodge the responsibility, can't you? But if you're the vicar and think you wouldn't invite people, well, sure, I need to do something then. So they were my sort of driving observations to say, if I wasn't sure I would invite people and we aren't serving the parish. So in terms then of what I did, I want to talk really about 3 new local congregations we set up before anyone thought of the trendy word for it. So there's 3 things we did. So the first was something called St Paul's at 4, which was at 4 o'clock. So we got rid of having, they used to have an evening service, but it was the same people who came to the morning and it was a similar style. So right, let's bring that to an end. But St Paul's at 4 o'clock. not surprisingly. So this sort of afternoon works with kids, sports, that's right, kids on Saturday morning. Also, we would find that Sunday morning, a lot of kids would be with the family they don't live with normally. But by late on Sunday, people were tending to be back home. And that 4 o'clock worked for families as part of the bedtime routine and getting back towards the Monday morning. So we found it was a good slot. And this was aimed at people with kids. And was intended to be informal, but informal not being a code for a particular style of music, but actually being informal. And so we would look at each other and have a bit of a laugh and have something great, some worship or whatever, 15 minutes, and then have a bit of a banter, and then have a sermon. And that, what I would call a magazine format, but just keeping it relatively, 15-minute, 20-minute chunks, a few of those. Surprisingly, I found it worked very well for quite a lot of older folks, because I'm just ignorant really, but I was surprised by the number of older men who didn't want to come to church because they needed to go to the loo, and getting up in a formal service was too embarrassing. But if you break the service up all the time, then the kids are doing something silly, they can nip out to the loo. So it was quite interesting, the sort of, and that really made me think about the accessibility issues and disability issues, about how much actually is what I was doing. Another, it's great for some people, but maybe not for others. We had food every time at the end, but food means some sandwiches that someone's just made in the vestry beforehand. And the whole thing about St Paul's at 4, we started with about 19 people, it's focused on the people. In our community, nothing was posh, nothing was excellent, nothing was that very clever. We didn't have any musicians. Tough, we put some stuff on CDs. After about 18 months, a 17-year-old offered to come and play some live music for us. That was brilliant. But it was about the people. It was gathering these people and doing things of worship and community that worked in their context. Running through, I remember one time when we got the bishop to come and confirm at this, and what was interesting is he thought he was coming and confirming a person, but the fact that the bishop was sort of coped with coming to it, and I was insistent we weren't going to change. This was their church, so we weren't going to suddenly turn into something else because the bishop turned up. And because the bishop was willing to sort of go along with that, actually what he did was confirm the faith and that God liked all of these people here, that their way of doing things was okay. So that's St Paul's at 4, and that soon got to be a similar number to the morning congregation, 40 people. It was never going to get bigger than that. It's not a problem to me. We doubled what we had before. Long Loaf was another thing we did. So this was a lunch club on a Wednesday lunchtime. And so this was about providing a meal, but it was very interesting having to get it right at the beginning. This wasn't about a sort of soup kitchen in the way people used to phrase it. And the key thing was, over the meal, we told a Bible story. And this was great. We didn't read the Bible. We told the story. And people loved, a group of 25 locals, a mixture. We tried to get some church people to come if they wanted lunch and, get a good mix of people. But inevitably, quite a few people were a little bit more on the margins. And honestly, tell a good story about the, ramming the tent peg through someone's head and all of this. People love it. And well, in that story in particular as well, that, he went into his tent afterwards and had a snooze, and then she comes and, all of that. But honestly, so the fact of telling these Bible stories, but equally I remember particularly telling the story of Jesus going to the meal with the Pharisees, and the woman, and we know what sort of woman she was, coming up behind him and washing his feet. This was so powerful because, a lot of the women in the room were seen as being, those sorts of women that wouldn't be respectable. And to tell this story, to voice this story, people, if you ever tried to not have a Bible story, people were up in arms. And the other thing is people love to pray. Now, the way I do it, you can see what I'm like, a bit of a gift of the gab, really, but the way I do it, you just say, what do you want to pray for? And I would then roll it into a bit of a prayer. Okay, well, I don't know whether that was a good thing to do or not, but that's how we did it. But honestly, people were coming out all the time, so, oh, can you pray for my daughter this? And you get all sorts of things. This person will be praying for a daughter, this person will be saying, oh, well, that stuff on the TV about the floods in wherever. And so right from the beginning, lunch, but we tell a Bible story, and those Bible stories are powerful. You don't need to preach a sermon. If you just voice the Bible story right and choose it right. And praying for each other. And the third thing I want to mention is the other thing we did, which we called Sofa. So Long Loaf got to about 30 or 40 as well. And then Sofa, this was after Alpha. Now, I know when some people talk about Alpha, they think it's lots of people in a posh room and whatever. Alpha for us was about 4 people, but we kept on plugging it away, and 4 people would come along each time, and they'd all decide they wanted to carry on with us, whether they came to a faith at that point or not. But they want to go. But after the first one of these, there were probably about 6 people. And I realised that every one of them worked on a Sunday. Sort of community, a lot of shift pattern work. Now that's quite common in quite a lot of places, more places now than it used to be. So what was I saying to them? You can be part of St. Paul's, we love you, you're on this faith journey, you can be part of St. Paul's, but you're always going to be second class because you happen to work on a Sunday and we do our stuff on a Sunday. Well, I wasn't going to say that to them. And I suppose this is my drive. These were the people I cared about. You walk the streets, if they're not in the church, what are we going to do? These people who have come to faith on Alpha, which was on a Wednesday night, what was I going to say to them? Well, obviously what they wanted, and so what we did, was to carry on having church on a Wednesday night, and of a style that they had found so great and had come to faith through. So a style which was about conversation. And about maybe some video material, and people would take turns bringing stuff, or little video courses, or worship or meditation stuff that they had seen off Facebook or whatever, and sharing it and talking about it. So that style of meeting together almost round a table, like your sort of Alpha type discussion, and that was the format in which they had been switched on to God. So what was the problem with carrying on, in a sense, with that? I remember we had a baptism like that. It was very interesting, of weaving in some liturgy to that, but this was not, their experience of church hadn't been the sort of hymn sandwich type thing, or even the sort of new church block of worship followed by a block of teaching. Their experience had been through this sort of discussion format sitting around a table. So we tried it. That was interesting on numbers. You couldn't get, I think, above about 25 with that, because to keep this discussion format. What's the problem there? So they were some of the things I did.
Brilliant. Okay. And any particular problems or things you learned in that time?
So what I learnt was, first of all, you've got to start how you're going to finish. I think this is so much the mistake people make. They think, we'll start a lunch club and 6 months later we'll start trying to do a little bit of Christian stuff in it. Well, I would be up in arms if you did that to me. You've got me under false pretenses, haven't you? I just don't think you can change from one thing to another. And so, but equally, when we were at St. Paul's at 4, people coming to faith, baptising people, the bishop coming for a confirmation, I was not going to sell them out by saying, we'll now do it properly and get out the hymn books. You have to start how you're going to finish. And there's lots of people in my parish wanting lunch. There's lots of organisations doing lunch things. We were doing the church doing it. And those people who didn't want to hear a Bible story, there's lots of other options. So starting how we were going to finish. And so similarly with St. Paul's at 4, the first day we had to make some butties because we were going to do food. Food was part of the package. Get on with it is the other thing I learned. I was really sad reading a Facebook thing from a vicar a few months ago. He was in rural Oxfordshire and he was saying how, he's really frustrated because everyone goes down to the big churches in Oxford and they don't stay and make church in the villages. And he had about 8 people in the villages, but they were so frustrated with how long it took to plant a new church that they gave up and went to the churches in the middle of Oxford. And I must admit, I scratched my head and thought, well, it takes about a month, doesn't it? Just decide you're going to do something and give it a go. Now, I'm a bit flippant, and it might take 3 months, but actually, what are we, or is it that we've got some shadow that if we're going to plant a new congregation, it has to be a £3 million investment and all singing, all dancing? People are what matter, so it's just looking around thinking, and the thing I really noticed was it's also about not believing you're going to buck the trend. When I came, because I was young and beautiful wife and little kids and all of that, they thought that if we carried on doing the 10:30 service and the baptism families and once a month all age, suddenly I was going to magically fill the place with kids. And I had to say to them after 6 months, sorry, you've been doing this brilliantly for the last 5 years. It isn't working, and me turning up is not going to suddenly make it work. You know, these baptism families were not sticking, because if they ever came, there was no one else like them. It was their grannies. But I wasn't going to buck the trend suddenly by being super wonderful. We needed to do something different that actually suited the people, shift patterns and all of that. Unity is a big issue if you're doing this. So we ended up, there was another thing we set up later in the pub for younger people. We ended up with about 6 of these local congregations. Unity is a big issue. My slogan was, everyone has the right to have something at St Paul's that they like. But you don't have the right to object to the bits you don't like. You know, if you don't like what the kids do and the young mums do on a Sunday afternoon, don't come. But you have every right to expect there should be something at St Paul's which reaches you. And if I'm fiddling with the 10:30 and making it young and trendy, tell me off. I'm doing something young and trendy somewhere else. So, and that really worked. After only about 6 months having to repeat the mantra, people got it, that if there wasn't something at St Paul's which worked for them and they lived in the parish, they could complain, but they can't complain about other people getting what they want. Family was a word I realised had some power, because all of us are used to the fact that we don't meet all of our family all of the time. Yeah? So I have a brother who lives in Reading. If you tell me he's not part of my family because I see him about once a year, I won't be very happy with you. We're used to the fact with family, and this is what really worked, because you could say it to the congregation. You could say, you know, Sally, you've got a brother in Sheffield, haven't you? How often do you see him? Well, 3 times a year. Is he part of your family? Yes. Great. So the St Paul's family, that being a family didn't mean we all had to be in the same place at the same time every week. Because we're not like that with our normal families. And even when you do get together at Christmas, the grannies sit in the parlour, front room, or whatever we call it nowadays. The teenagers hang out somewhere doing something you hope you don't see. The mums are in the kitchen, busying around and having a good gas. Even when you do get together, a real life family we're all used to, it's one Christmas party, it's one family, but we don't ever pretend we've got to all enjoy doing the same thing in the same room. Or you might do for 10 minutes, and then the teenagers slope off, and the kids are sent out to the trampoline, and the grannies can chat in the front room. So actually the family illustration, I think, really helped people realise you can be one family, St Paul's, without all doing the same thing at the same time. Sacraments, I realised, what was interesting was I had to push the sacraments a bit, that people connected the sacraments with a particular way of doing church. And it took a little bit of pressure from me to say, no, at sofa, so the chat discussion type thing, we were going to have communion occasionally. And if someone from there was being baptised, no, we weren't going to ship them off to another service. We were going to do it in this format. And it was interesting, the inbuilt conservatism of people who they thought, oh, but those things are not allowed unless you do it in a particular style. So I needed to actively push the sacraments to say, no, this is part of your experience too. Problems, you can never shut me up. Problems, power. You know, the key thing is, at what point are PCC members being elected from these other congregations? That's the point. I remember the first year having to push the point we were not going to have the AGM after the Sunday morning service, because that prioritised the attendance from the Sunday morning people. So actually attending to those power dynamics. Of course, after a few years, the older, I don't want to talk about old folks flippantly, but the older congregation, they suddenly loved this. Because there were all these new people with jobs and had lots of, well, not all with jobs, but had lots of time, some of them, and energy to do all the tasks in the church. Once, after about 2 years, it suddenly worked out that, hang on a minute, the PCC is being refreshed. We've got someone in the 30s being willing to be church warden. But actually pushing that power thing was difficult to begin with. The 2-year thing, I think, was an issue because people also started to think, well, hang on a sec, we're funding it all. Why aren't these people giving much? And that was a fair challenge. But what I saw was after a couple of years, everyone thought, hey, this is brilliant. There's now something, it's not going to be a carpet warehouse after I die. There is going to be a church for my grandkids. You know, those things that actually the existing congregation really cared about. But they didn't think to begin with there was any hope of this working. Every church you witnessed for the previous 50 years had shrunk. So they had no hope. Once after 2 years they realised, hey, actually this could work. It got a lot easier. The final thing that I learned is the main challenge. Well, there's all sorts of challenges, but I do think one of the challenges to this is the pride of the vicar. Because in doing this, in going this way, we had a lot of success in many ways. But I had to accept I was never going to be standing in front of a congregation of more than 40 people. And that was an intriguing pride thing. You know, I am proud of what we did. And, you know, I can talk about it excitedly, whatever. But part of it was accepting. I was never going to be like, oh, this big church leader and the 200 people, or 120 people counted as big church in Liverpool, but, 200 people in this congregation, and I'm the vicar up the front, and there's all those faces looking up at me, and hey, look, this looks successful. Every one of these new local congregations looked bedraggled and just about keeping going. Because they were 20, 30, 40 people. It's a difficult number. And I had to accept the pride issues to say I was never going to be standing in front of the big crowd. It was always going to look a bit ropey. So that was a final reflection for me.
Oh, Jeremy, thank you so much
Not at
for your
all.
time and for driving all this way as well. No.